I thank France.
Going to have a stop in the list of speakers to provide the opportunity to the delegation of St. Vincent to refer to those questions that has been presented. And now we would like to welcome the rest of the delegation. That delegation has been strengthened, and particularly to now have a more gender balance. Welcome, madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I introduce my reinforcements. Mrs. Charles from our mission in the United Kingdom. I thank the 11 states that have spoken so far and made their contributions, and I'd like to respond to some of them if I may. Some have already been dealt with to some degree in our opening statement, but I would like to thank you and take the opportunity to respond to some of the other ones in no particular order. I note that a number of states have raised the issue of legislation regarding sexual activity between consenting adults. St. Vincent and the Grenadines indeed has a number of legislative provisions that deal with sexual activity between consenting adults. For example, we have legislation against incest, which deals with sexual activity between relatives, even if they may be consenting adults. We have legislation against prostitution, which deals with sexual activity, again, that may be between consenting adults. We have legislation against public indecency. We have legislation against same-sex acts. And we have legislation against buggery, which is an umbrella term dealing with both sodomy and bestiality. All of these are on the books, and all of them enjoy considerable popular support within our country and within our society. And many of these provisions exist to one extent or another in other member states. Regarding the specificity that some have specifically asked for discuss legislation on same-sex relations, I note that our buggery laws were inherited from the United Kingdom, and that they were almost a verbatim reproduction of the legislation that obtained in the Buggery Act of 1533 and later the Offences Against the Persons Act of 1861 in the United Kingdom, which were finally abolished in approximately 2003. So given the 400 and odd years expanse of legislation in that regard, we think we're pretty early on the curve, having only been independent for roughly 30 years. And we don't retain the punishments that obtained in those legislations, where I recall that the Buggery Act had a punishment of death at one point in the United Kingdom, which was then changed to life imprisonment, which was then further reduced. Nonetheless, the act is popular in our country and as a reflection of our own moral and societal context, and there is no appetite in the populace or in the government for its repeal at this point in time. The issue of violence against women is a serious one. We think that any example of violence against women is one too many. We would respectfully differ with those who say that it is particularly high, unless we have a sense of high relative to what standard. But we do accept that violence against women exists, and domestic violence exists. The St. Vincent and the Grenadines has legislation, a Domestic Violence Act. The government is currently drafting new legislation to strengthen that act. We have conducted a number of public awareness campaigns and continue to do so. And the police, which in the past could have been legitimately accused of being insensitive or less sensitive than they should be to allegations of violence against women and domestic violence, the police have been and continue to be trained to be more sensitive to these issues. The issue of the corporal punishment of juveniles has been raised by a variety of states. I would respectfully beg to differ with the representative that said that beating with a stick was widespread. That is not true. But corporal punishment does exist legislatively, and the legislation continues to constrain the instances in which corporal punishment can be used on juveniles. There is no mood, there is no appetite to curtail corporal punishment in the home. Although, of course, we do have very strict child abuse laws. As a criminal sentence, we have done our checks and no one can recall the last time that corporal punishment was actually used as a criminal sentence, as an act. Let me clarify. It is often part of a sentence given to children in this sense. A juvenile over the age of 16 is often sentenced in the following way. They're given a tour of a prison, sort of to scare them straight. And then they are given a probationary term, and then they are given a curfew. And the provision is that if the curfew is violated, corporal punishment may be implemented, but it has not happened. Those stages are usually sufficient to, as they say colloquially, scare someone straight. The representative of the United Kingdom mentioned proper consultation regarding legislation affecting the rights of citizens. In our opening statement, we detailed a very, very lengthy process. It was a multi-year process and a multi-stakeholder process dealing with the reform to our Constitution, which was then put to a vote. It involved consultations throughout the length and breadth of the country, on television, on radio, and even in the diaspora. And that is the way in which we approach legislation involving the rights of citizens. To the extent that the representative was referring to a particular piece of legislation that was referred to in their advanced questions, which was the representation of the People Amendment, I'd like to indicate that that did not deal with the rights of citizens in that sense. It dealt with essentially the rights of politicians, which may be a lower class of citizen in some contexts. But that particular piece of legislation actually was designed to decriminalize a speech. The legislation as it currently exists has a penalty, a criminal penalty, involving jail time and a suspension from political practice if one utters a falsehood during an election campaign. And the idea is to eliminate that criminal penalty while, of course, retaining the full range of civil measures to combat defamation. That piece of legislation is currently in select committee. We have a similar judicial system, so you know that in select committee there will be further consultations in that regard. But that is not a piece of legislation that to use your phrasing, would affect the rights of citizens. Questions have been raised about prisons and the rate of incarceration. I'm happy to report that the government has constructed a new correctional facility, and inmate transfers will begin in June of this year, that's next month, to this new facility. The old facility is indeed very overcrowded, and that is what spurred the creation of this new facility. The new facility has a minimum, medium, and maximum security wing. It has vocational training. It has a farm where the prisoners will learn to farm and to feed the facility. The high rate of incarceration, again, we'd beg to differ with that characterization. Very often, if one uses a measure of inmates per 100,000, it's difficult to have an accurate statistical measure if your population is only 100,000. The prison population of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is roughly 400 people, and that's not a large number. And additionally, that doesn't speak so much to the rate of incarceration as it does to the length of sentence. There are many countries that have a much higher rate of sentencing people to jail, but they tend to have shorter sentences. So if you took a snapshot, it would appear that they had less, but they've actually sent more people through the system than we have. The question regarding street children from the representative of France, there has been a street children rehabilitation project in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It began in 2006. It did an extensive study of street children in St. Vincent. The numbers were small enough that we were able to interview the individual street children to learn of their particular situation. There has been a pilot program which has reported some success in getting some of these children to return to school or to reconciling them with their parents. Some of them have very difficult family situations. We have also invested in improving the facilities for children who do not have a home situation. There is a home for boys, and the street children phenomenon is essentially, well, not essentially, but largely a problem for males in our society. The questions raised on the death penalty. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has voted against the provision for a moratorium on the death penalty because the death penalty continues to exist in our national legislation, and we think that voting against something that exists in our own laws would be difficult to reconcile that. But as delegates have indicated, the death penalty has not been practiced in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. No one has been executed in roughly 15 years. And this is another example of the way that the common law can affect legislation. The law has not changed, but the common law interpretation of that particular piece of legislation has changed. The death penalty is no longer mandatory, and the death penalty is only given in the most extreme cases. And the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council has indicated that if someone is on death row for longer than 5 years, their sentence must be commuted to life. Now, it is practically impossible to complete the full course of appeals in less than 5 years. So it is almost an automatic life sentence, given the current situation of the common law. And I encourage those countries that have civil law jurisdictions to also consider the ways in which the common law can shape and mold the imposition of the death penalty. I would like to acknowledge all of those states that discussed development, the right to development and our efforts towards development. St. Vincent and the Grenadines really believes that development will be the engine of further advancements in human rights, and that education will be the engine of that engine. So we continue to invest very heavily in education in a multitude of situations, preschool, primary, secondary, and tertiary education is a very strong priority. The distinguished representative of Cuba was modest in saying that they made modest contributions. We thank them for their assistance in healthcare, in the construction of a hospital, in the loan of doctors and nurses, in the education of many of our doctors and nurses, in the conduct of studies related to disabled people and the less fortunate, and for their ophthalmology program, which has restored the sight of thousands of Vincentians. And that is, of course, part and parcel of our right to health. I think that deals with the majority of these questions, and I look forward to hearing more.
Thank you very much for your very comprehensive responses to so many issues that has been presented to you. Vamos ahora a